I'm sure you've all
Lawyer's
seen this video
reaction.
by now, and there's a lot of debate online regarding whether or not there's any police brutality that occurred with Mr. Hill's arrest. Now, as a former felony prosecutor and somebody who handles police brutality cases, I'm going to break down exactly what happened in each clip of the video. In order to properly analyze whether the officers used excessive force, we need to take into account everything that occurred prior to the video being turned on. Here, Mr. Hill was pulled over and later issued a citation for careless driving, which is a non-criminal traffic infraction, no different than a speeding ticket. When Mr. Hill was pulled over by the police, it started an investigation. This is important because when there's a pending investigation going on, you have to comply with an officer's valid and reasonable requests. If you don't, you could potentially get arrested or charged with resisting. If an officer pulls you over and orders you to roll down your windows, you cannot just choose to ignore them and roll up your windows. You have to analyze this from the officer's perspective. They don't know who they pulled over and whether or not they are armed. All they know is that they pulled somebody over who's being non-compliant and then is rolling up the windows, shielding them from seeing what's going on within the car, which can pose a safety risk to the officers if Mr. Hill was armed with a weapon. During a traffic stop, police can order you out of the car for their own safety, to check for weapons, or to make an arrest. Here, the police ordered him to keep his windows down. He refused. He was becoming non-compliant and posing a risk to the officers. At that point of time, they could have ordered him out, which they did, for their own safety. They can even place you in handcuffs pending investigation. Were the police quick to pull Mr. Hill out of the car? Yes. Did the police use force? Yes, but the police are allowed to use reasonable force in order to get somebody to comply or make an arrest. Now, is it excessive the way the police pulled Mr. Hill out of the car and threw him to the ground? Could they have waited a little bit longer to see if he got out? Yes. But again, this is a traffic stop and not all the officers at the time knew who Mr. Hill was. They didn't know what kind of risk or hazard he posed to them. At first, it seems excessive the way the police pulled Mr. Hill out of the car and threw him to the ground. However, they already told him they were going to arrest him at that point in time. There's only so many ways to place somebody in handcuffs who isn't being compliant. These situations can go from bad to worse very quickly. And most of this could have been avoided if Mr. Hill was just compliant from the start. We're saying, what if it wasn't Hill? Well, what if Mr. Hill was compliant? What if Mr. Hill didn't argue from the start and just complied with their request? Could all of this been avoided? I don't know that, but it can go either way. But what I've seen in my experience is that it always starts with people who are disrespectful and not compliant with police officers. Now, whether or not a police officer has justifiable cause to arrest you or detain you is something you can't argue with at that time. You don't argue with someone who has a gun. You just have to suck it up and deal with it later. Because the more you fight, the worse it can get.